This Wave of Conviction has 500% damage over time multiplier, and that's with no nodes on the tree giving dot multi, and no explicit modifiers on gear giving dot multi either. A little while back, I was looking up some hideout art in PoE, and I realized that hideout architects also play the game sometimes, and I was shown this modifier, this Crucible tree modifier that gives you damage over time multiplier for each second that Wave of Conviction has persisted. In short, Wave of Conviction has two parts of skill effect duration. The secondary part is for how long exposure applies after you use the wave. The first part though applies to the skill itself. Wave of Conviction is actually a duration skill, and when you scale skill effect duration, it will affect how long the Wave of Conviction will travel. When you use this Crucible modifier though, you also get dot multi per second that it's traveled, and in my particular setup, I'm running a 1.7 second duration Wave of Conviction, giving me 500% damage over time multiplier at the tip of its travel. Now this sort of plays like Far Shot for projectile skills except with Wave Conviction, and it takes a little bit of getting used to when you're doing bosses. When you're clearing, however, you definitely don't need to optimize that sort of damage, especially on an Ignite Proliferation build, and it's been one of the smoothest builds I've played this league, kind of on par with RF. That said though, my boss damage has been much better, the bossing playstyle is much better, and it just has so much more room to grow if you're able to scale this up. At this point, I've killed all the non-Uber bosses in the game, and I don't really want to take this build into Uber bosses before changing my defensive setup to go into Divine Flesh. But for now, let's go over the build concept, the POB, and some of the details here. So let's talk about the most important modifier first, this Wave Conviction damage over time multi per 0.1 seconds of duration expired. It's on my weapon, it's on my shield, and it's even on my helmet, this El Abin's Visage, which lets you grab Crucible trees on helmet. Basically, without this, I do almost no damage, and I've custom written it into my config for 500%. This is at max travel. You can see without this, I go from 6 million to 1.3 million DPS, so it's a huge difference. It's basically 5 times more damage. Beyond this though, let's go over the rest of the gear. Wave Conviction is really nice because you can go +1 Fizz, +1 Lightning, or +1 Fire when you're trying to craft. I also use Essences of Anguish, I think, for fire damage to spells. For my shield, same deal, really easy to craft. This thing was pretty lucky, looking for things like this. And because I have so much suppression off my skill tree, I'm able to use an energy shield base while still being suppression capped. For the helmet, any tree is good as long as it has this modifier. I'm not really sure what other things are available on the market in SC trade, but on HC is fairly limited. I use Lightning Cloak because I'm skipping Determination. I would actually prefer to use Cloak of Flame, but then you need to build 15% more suppression because I don't have the mastery on tree running Cloak of Flame. In any case though, what I'd actually be aiming for is to look for a +2 or a +3 or +4 chest, a corrupted one, and then be using that because it's a huge boost to your damage. For my gloves, I want that Ignite Prolif implicit. Ignite Prolif as a support gem actually has better AoE and better clear, but because Wave Conviction in my setup is so freaking big, I don't really feel like I need more clear. Also other things like suppression, life res. Boots, again, suppression, life res. I use these two implicit modifiers, both really powerful. You could also maybe opt for Legacy of Fury if you want to get more suppression elsewhere. On the amulet slot, I only look for +1 and then defensives and non-damaging elements. I would never look for damage over time multiplier on gear because again, you have so much from the Crucible tree implicits. The amount that you can get from gear, like 20% multi here, is probably worth somewhere in the range of 2% more damage, which is almost nothing. Polaric Devastation is a great all-round ring for Ignite builds, and then I run Death Rush while mapping. Now, for bossing, especially if you're running Cloak of Flames and Awaken Unbound Ailments, you can swap Death Rush for Replica Emberwake, but that really scales your Ignite duration all the way down. Although it does give you a huge damage boost, I prefer to have the consistency and the smoother playstyle, so I just run a life res ring when I boss. You could also maybe go for something like, I don't know, Taming or something like that for more damage. For the belt, I have to run a Crystal Belt because my energy shield pool was too small to comfortably sustain my Divine Blessing and my Wave Conviction casting. Ideally, this could eventually become a Stitch Advise, but I actually don't think that's a big deal. I think this is totally fine to use. One thing to note about flasks is that any Fizz Az is very powerful for walk Ignite builds. So I'm using Aziri's Promise, but Taste of Hate would actually be my ideal flask. Unfortunately, I was too poor in hardcore. It's somewhere in the range of 5 to 10 divines to get a Taste of Hate, and I just don't have that much money to spare right now because Ashes of the Stars won't drop for me. But yeah, I tend to use those two flasks. The last interesting piece of gear is this Lethal Pride. So there's a bunch of good modifiers I can look for. One is this Faster Ignite, which is a huge more damage over time multiplier, especially when I'm not running Replica Emberwake. There's also things like Fire Res, Strength on gear, and increased Fizz damage and burning damage. It's just a bunch of good modifiers, and especially if you're placing it somewhere like this on the tree, it's actually quite strong. I'm even taking Veteran Soldier, which isn't a particularly good node since it gives you Fizz.multi, giving you nothing, but the nodes leading up to it gives you some increased damage, and this still gives you a little bit of flat life. That's how good I think Lethal Pride is for this build. Ideally, though, you'd be running a double Fizz as or triple Fizz as Lethal Pride, pairing that with a Purity of Elements Watcher's Eye for more Fizz taken as, running Taste of Hate, Lightning Coil with a +2, and eventually getting enough Fizz taken as that you actually need no physical mitigation at all. For the rest of the tree, it's quite a gross travel tree, but this tends to be the easiest way to set up your gearing for hardcore. One thing to note is that I am skipping Elemental Overload, and this is something you can get much later, but it requires different things on gear. You would want to get crit chance on the Scepter. You would also need to get the Boot Enchant for crit chance if you haven't crit recently, and then I'd also want to path into Dire Torment, which is really, really great. Grab this as well. And then I could grab EO while dropping some life nodes. But that's just not something I want to do in this current setup. Otherwise, I'm pathing over naturally to Eldritch Battery, Whispers of Doom is up here, and then I go all the way down here for a ton of Suppression, Skill Effect Duration, which is a big, powerful modifier for this build, which is why I go for both of the wheels over here, and then just, life around the tree. The skill gem setup is pretty unleveled right now, and with gem levels, this improves significantly. Just leveling Awakened Gemstone takes this build from 6 million to almost 9 million DPS, but anyways, that's not super important. For now, this is my skill gem setup. Walk, I run Efficacy, which is a really great support because it gives you not only damage over time, but also gives you skill effect duration. So the all quality here is pretty sweet. Other things, pretty self-explanatory. I run Cast Damage Taken and Moral Call because Molten Shell gives me nothing, because I'm running a no armor setup. DB and Malevolence, again, really great setup. Similar to Efficacy, you get both more damage over time, and you get skill effect duration. Dual Curse, Flame Surge, and Arcanist Brand, Vortex, Combustion, Frostblink. This is just to apply Combustion. This isn't really for anything else. I was using it for the lingering chill effect, but eventually I swapped over to Shaper of Winter in this setup because I really think that 40% chill is completely broken when you're doing bosses. If you didn't want to run this, both Heart of Destruction and Bastion are really strong, but honestly, Shaper of Winter is broken. I do run Purity of Elements on this build because frankly there aren't really great offensive auras other than Hatred, but I do swap Hatred for Grace when I boss, so I don't really need to worry about running Hatred. And then I'm running Precision just for a little bit of crit chance should I want to spec into Elemental Overload later, but otherwise this gives me 8% more damage because of the Aura Mastery. Herald of Ash gives you a little bit more damage. I was using Flesh and Stone at times. I was also thinking about using Herald of Purity, but I don't like that. Just in case those things spawn, boss targets them, you try to dodge, and then you end up dodging into where your Herald of Purity dudes were. Finally, Shield Charge, Fast Attacks, Grace, and then a Blood Rage to make my mapping just a little bit faster. So all in all, this isn't a super novel build, but it is basically 5 times stronger this patch because of the Crucible tree. Normally, low budget Wave Conviction Ignite builds really struggle with boss damage. Clearly, this one hasn't, especially since I'm running a low investment setup in hardcore. So yeah, if you're looking for a really smooth, cheap Ignite build to get set up that can scale all the way from the start of the game to the end, I think this is a really cool idea to go for, and something you can easily push just because of how incredibly strong dot multi but skill effect duration scaling can be.